Good evening. This is a painting by Van Gogh. It's called The Sower. And low down on the horizon, you can see a large object, which, from the point of view of size, might be either the sun or the moon, because the sun and the moon appear just about the same size in our sky. But I'm afraid the artist has got it wrong, and artists always do, because the sun and the moon don't appear nearly so large in the sky as most people believe. And it's the apparent size of the moon that we want to talk about this evening. Have you ever seen the moon rising low over the horizon, over the sea or anything like that? Well, if so, you may think that it seems very large, and that as it rises high above the horizon, it becomes smaller. And I think most people will tell you that the low-down full moon looks very much larger than the full moon when it's high up. In fact, it doesn't. This is a well-known illusion. And it's particularly well marked, I think, at the time of what we call the hunter's moon and the harvest moon. Harvest moon was last month, hunter's moon is this month. Now, let me say straight away that, in fact, the low moon and the harvest moon and the hunter's moon do not look any larger, really, than the moon when it's high up. This is a pure illusion. And yet, undoubtedly, there is there the impression that the low moon appears huge. And just why this is so, no one has really explained thoroughly. At least I don't think so. And so this evening, we're going to try and do a bit of research, as well as telling you what we found out. So let's begin with some of the ideas that have been put forward and don't stand up to examination. There was one idea, that if the moon is low down, its light's coming to us through a thick layer of the Earth's air, and the dust in the atmosphere smears the moon's light around and gives the moon the impression of being larger than it really is. But I'm afraid this won't do at all, for reasons we'll tell you a bit later on. A much better idea was put forward a long time ago, round about AD 150, by the last great astronomer of classical times, Ptolemy. And his idea had to do with apparent distance and what he called filled space. Now, it's quite true that when you see the moon low over the horizon, you see terrestrial objects between you and it, things like low bushes or fences or anything you like. On the other hand, when the moon is high up, you're seeing it against empty space. There is apparently nothing at all between you and it. And this makes the moon appear subconsciously at a different distance, and this affects its size. Well, that's what Ptolemy said. He's not entirely correct, but he may have been on the right track. One man who's an expert on illusions, and all kinds of other things, is Professor Richard Gregory. And this is what we were talking about last night down by the sea, here at Sept. You know, I think it's largely a matter of perspective. If I walk away from you, I appear to get smaller. But is this because you know what size I really am, or because you're relating me to known objects around me?
Well, I think both are true, but particularly the second. I think if you'd like to walk along the beach, we can see what it looks like.
Right.
Now, Patrick's walking along the beach, and he's walking along posts which are in fact equal in height, groins, and he's shrinking at my eye and at the camera, so that as he doubles in distance, the image in the eye or the camera shrinks to a half. But I think he doesn't look as if he's shrinking quite as much as one would expect. The brain is compensating for this, and to do this it uses information of perspective, texture of the pebbles on the beach, and if it was not something I knew, like the size of Patrick, it would still work. If I apply this perspective strategy from the Earth to the moon, then the moon looks the wrong size, and this, I think, is what is happening. We're treating the moon as though it were an object on Earth, when in fact it is not.
So when you're considering the moon illusion, there are all kinds of things to be taken into account, and it is a surprisingly complicated problem. And incidentally, it has nothing to do with actual distance, because the low moon is no closer to us than the high-up moon, and so that idea won't do either. Now, what about this dust theory? Richard, am I right or wrong in saying that it just won't do?
Well, I'm sure you're right, Patrick. The dust theory, I think, quite clearly won't do in the optical version of the theory, namely that the dust spreads the image so that the image is physically larger at the eye. One can demonstrate this with a camera. The image in a camera is just the same size if the moon is on the horizon or if it's high up, and therefore it should be the same size in the retinal image of the eye, whether the moon is high up or on the horizon. So dust can't, I think, be doing that. But there's an alternative theory which although a physical origin, dust, is essentially a psychological theory which was put forward in the 18th century by Bishop Berkeley. And he had a curious theory, which is that the dust makes the moon fainter, that the brain interprets the retinal image, which although the same size is fainter and so might be attributed to a further away object and so a larger one. I'll do a little primitive experiment to indicate that this is wrong. If we put a dark glass, which I've got here, in front of a light, this globe, it gets dimmer, but it doesn't really look larger or smaller when I change its brightness. It's a very primitive experiment. One can do this for oneself with the actual moon with a dark glass or sunglasses. It doesn't really change size with brightness, therefore dust should not be relevant. I think another bit of evidence here is that you get the illusion when the moon is not actually on the true horizon, but when it's close to distant mountains or even a tall building in a city. This suggests that it's not the atmospheric conditions at all, but rather the effect of neighbouring objects on the interpreted size of the object for the same sized retinal image. This is a tricky business. I think at this stage we really should look at the whole question of how we judge the size and the distances of any objects. This diagram shows, in a way, two things. It shows that the same sized image in the eye can be due to objects of very different sizes. That's an essential point. It also shows that the object must be further away and bigger to produce the same sized image in the eye as a nearer and smaller object. That's fairly obvious, but it's worth just looking at it. Now, more interesting perhaps is this. We all know that people are smaller than buses and buses are smaller than buildings, usually. Now, it could be, at first sight, that we simply recognise it's a person or a bus or a building, we know what sort of size that is, therefore we see it at that sort of size, and therefore we know the distance, we guess the distance. But this can't be quite the whole answer, because we can recognise that a building is particularly small, that a person is a dwarf or giant, or that a bus is a model bus, a dinky toy. So we must judge distance independently of the assumed size of an object. And this is where perspective comes in. We normally see objects along roads or along fields or along beaches with a whole lot of other objects distributed around or parallel lines in a city. These are used as, so to speak, guidelines. We assume certain things about the world and we set objects along the world according to these assumptions. And you can say, if you like, the brain carries out a strategy here for guessing the distances of objects, deducing the size from the distance, and this works fine in a normal world. But pictures are not normal. If you put perspective on a flat plane, we get distortions, which we'll look at in a moment, and for a slightly different reason, but related, I think, the moon illusion occurs. This is a nice phenomenon of distortion. Radiating lines move a square across them, and watch the square. It's actually a very perfect square, but it jolly well doesn't look it against those lines. They affect the perceptual mechanism, produce a distortion which is related, almost certainly, to the moon illusion. These sort of distortion illusions, which you see in static forms in lots of children's books, I think reveal a very important point, directly relevant to the moon illusion, although they may look different at first sight. What they show is that the brain can change the size or the shape from the image in the eye, that the perceptual system is not like a sort of passive camera or even a passive television type of system with an input and then the answer pops out without a great deal happening in the middle. Now, I'll try and demonstrate in a rather different way how your own brain can scale something very familiar to you, that is, change its apparent shape or size, namely your own hands. So the only apparatus is yourself. If you'd like to try putting one hand out at arm's length, I've got my arm straight here with my hand on the end of it, and I put my other hand at the elbow, so it's about half the distance from the first hand to my eyes, and I'm now looking at both my hands. Try the same thing. It may be easy to shut one eye. Now, if I move my hands out a bit like that, so I see them both separately, they look jolly nearly the same size. But when I move this one in, this is overlapping or hiding part of the further hand, and bingo, they look quite different sizes. This first hand looks about half the size as the near one. I seem to have a dwarf's hand here and a giant's hand here, and I can do that over and over again, and it simply changes size each time. Now, when they're separated, the brain can compensate for the change in the size of the retinal image with distance. When they're overlapping, it can't do that. Now, the trick and link from this sort of thing to the moon illusion, we think, is that if this scaling, that is the modification from the size of the retinal image to the size of an object according to apparent distance and clues and all the rest of it, is wrong, is inappropriate, then we must get distortions. And we think in the funny case of the moon, this sort of adjustment of size is wrong, making the moon the wrong size. What we know jolly little about, which is unfortunate, although there are recent very exciting experiments on this, is how human beings ever come to relate the pictures in their eyes to external objects in order to get the size and distances of things roughly correctly. If one looks at a baby crawling about, touching things, putting objects in its mouth, going towards an object and having to make several crawls or steps to it, sometimes reaching it, sometimes not, one has this feeling that it's building up correlations between the external world, which it discovers by touching and often hurting itself, to the pictures in its eyes, and that this is a long process of learning. Some of it may be innate. This is what we know very little about at present. Now, whether it's innate, that is built in from birth, or whether the baby has to learn it, whether we had to learn it, it's pretty reasonable, I think, to say that what we have learnt by objects within a room and then in a playing field, in a restricted environment around us, that these lessons, these correlations, are not likely to apply to objects very much further than Earth itself. The problem for the astronomer, or anybody looking at the moon, is that the lessons that we learned as children, crawling about, touching objects around us, simply do not apply to objects as distant as the moon. You might like to look at another illusion, which I think is actually new, and which you can try for yourself with a children's construction toy. I've got a bit with me. Patrick, perhaps we can just get rid of that for a minute. Now, the construction toy is this plastic thing, which you can set to make a rectangular shape. It's in fact purely rectangular, but it's got very marked stripes. These are actually white and red. I think the colours don't matter. Now, the illusion is this. If I lay that so that you look at it from near one end, now look at its shape, I think it's surprising. I think, and check me, that you'll find the further part, where my finger is, looking too big, that is, looking larger than the nearer part. But that's the wrong way round for perspective, both for the camera and also for your eye, or my eye, looking at it directly. Now, to show there's no sort of trick about this, I'm going to rotate it slowly, and I think you'll see it distort as I rotate it. I'm going to move my hands around a bit, and I think you'll find, again, the further part looks too big, though this was the end that was the nearer part. Therefore, this is an illusory distortion. The thing is actually rectangular, and it's these very marked stripes that appear here to upset perception of an object.
Well, yes, I agree. Even everyday objects can be wrongly seen sometimes, but on the whole, the brain gets it pretty well right. For instance, if you go outside and look at a distant object, such as a chimney pot or something like that, and then pick up a stone and try and select the right-sized stone, which, when held at arm's length, will just about cover the distant chimney pot, well, you'll probably get it pretty well right. But you try it with the moon, and I'll guarantee that you'll get it wrong. You'll select a stone that is far too big. Down on the beach at Chelsea, we did precisely that. Various people had been watching us film, and on the spur of the moment, I called them in and asked them whether they'd help us with a little experiment. And the results were very interesting indeed.
Now, what we want you to do, and only once, please, is to look at the moon, then look down at these stones we can see here, and then pick up the stone which you think will just cover the moon when you hold it out at arm's length. And when you've done that, please keep the stones and only do it once. Right, will you all look at the moon? Look down at the stones, and now pick up the stone you think will just cover the moon at arm's length, and then try it. And don't please throw the stones away. Keep them. Right? And now I will show you the size of the stone. Would you just do it for me?
Please.
A tiny little stone. May I now please have the stones that you actually selected? And you see, the whole point of this experiment was that I am perfectly certain that everybody selected stones which were much too big. And this is exactly what this program is all about. When you look at the moon, you imagine it looks far bigger than it actually does. And you're nearest, I think. You're still much too big. And I think that does in fact prove what the point we've been trying to make. This is the moon illusion. And this is exactly what we're trying to show. And when you compare these together, it'll just bring that point out. This has been a most interesting experiment because we thought when we started that people would pick up stones which were very much too big. And this is exactly what happened. Look at that collection of stones there, and now look at the right one. When I hold out that little stone at arm's length, that just about covers the moon. And everybody else, predictably, selected stones which are very much too large. And this does go to show that people who are not in the know always imagine that in the sky the moon looks a great deal larger than it really does.
But up to now, we've been measuring the sizes which things really are. If you try and measure the size of the thing seems, this is very much more difficult. And we've devised another experiment to do just that. Using this apparatus, I reckon we can produce a moon illusion all right.
I think we should, and I think we should be able to measure it. Let's have a look at it, shall we, Patrick?
Yeah.
Well, now, first of all, we've got sort of an artificial moon, which is really a comparison moon. It's simply a patch of light. We can vary the size of it with this iris, and it has a scale. It's a bit crude, but we can get some idea of its size. And the idea is that we place this next to the real moon in the sky and adjust it to the apparent size of the moon. The second trick is that we move the moon up and down optically and judge this against the moon when the moon is high and when it's low, and this involves a second bit of apparatus.
Let's have a look at that.
Right.
Our mirror, which will reflect the real moon, and the moon's quite high in the sky now.
Yeah, right, but we can make it either high or low, so we don't mind much where it is, because we can reflect the real moon off this tilting mirror, through which we can also see. And that's a rather cunning trick. It enables us to move the moon up and down in the sky, keep the horizon constant, and also not affect our comparison moon. Therefore, if that thing has to be set small when the moon is high, larger when it's low, and we look at the difference, the percentage difference, we've measured the illusion.
Well, whether this has been done in quite this form, I don't know. Anyway, let's try it. If I observe, you can work the iris.
Jolly good.
Right.
Well, I can see the artificial moon, I can see the iris. So first of all, we'll bring the moon down almost to the horizon until it's sitting almost on top of those wooden posts. And now, Richard, will you increase the iris, which at the moment looks much smaller than the moon? Quite a bit smaller. More than that. Increase further. Further still, please. A little bit more, nearly there, a little bit more still. Now, those two now appear the same size to me, although, of course, not the same, because the iris appears much brighter. Now we'll lift the moon up, and there is quite definitely an apparent shrinkage. There is an illusion there. Now, will you please decrease the iris very slightly, Richard? A little more. Now, that's right. And to me, those two now appear the same size. So there very definitely is an illusion, according to the height of the moon above your horizon.
You know, the more we look at this problem, the more complicated it appears. And there are plenty of things we haven't mentioned yet. What about Mr. Boring, for instance?
Well, Mr. Boring is an American psychologist who is not really boring at all. He had a lot of interesting ideas. Thinking about the moon illusion, he, for example, looked at it standing on his head, and he'd bend over and look between his legs.
I know, I tried that on the beach last night, and it wasn't an outstanding success.
Well, he made measurements somewhat similar to ours, but in funny postures, and he found that there were changes in the apparent size of the moon, but that these changes were not enough to explain the whole illusion. What he says is partly right, but again, only part of a truth, that the angle of the eye and the head is perhaps normally related to the distance of things. You know, when you're looking horizontally, you're normally looking at the horizon. And also, there's some evidence the whole sky is perceptually like a sort of flattened dome, nearer perceptually above you, further away on the horizon, partly as a function of eye position.
You know, Richard, we've been talking about the moon illusion now for some time, and we've put forward all kinds of suggestions. I think we've carried out some original research, or rather you have. But let's now come and try and give a summary. What is the answer to the moon illusion? What actually causes it?
Well, I think one must say several things cause it. I think our knowledge is limited because we don't know an awful lot about how the brain works anyway, how I can recognize you or you me. Until we understand this in detail, we can't explain illusion in detail. I think we can, however, say that the eyes are rather like instruments, scientific instruments. They have to be calibrated. They can only be used when assumptions about the external world are applied. When these assumptions are wrong, when the situation is peculiar, just as instruments give funny readings, so the eyes mislead the brain can't then cope with the information they provide. This is a sort of general statement, but it's true. Now, funny perspective can do it. Very, very distant objects outside the range of calibration, so to speak, can do it.
And so seeing is not always believing, and the moon's a deceptive thing. And when you see it in the sky and you take it to be the size of a golf ball, well, it's rather interesting to remember that, in fact, you can cover it by means of a paperclip held out at arm's length. Good night.